Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Today we're going to be talking about Ayn Rand and Objectivism. We're talking about this because the Objectivist movement has had a negative impact on the world as a whole. I know that sounds kind of dramatic, but the philosophy of Objectivism has had a major influence on generations of political and religious leaders. Most people aren't even aware of the term or philosophy, and though many are aware of libertarians such as Rand Paul, many don't understand how that worldview came to be or why it's so harmful. A little background before we get into this, so people don't think I'm being biased. I'm currently a leftist. I fall between socialist and communist on my political leanings, but I used to be an objectivist libertarian, and let me tell you, the switch was not an easy one. It was hard fought and emotional, and I implore anyone watching this to keep an open mind as we discuss this. First of all, who was Ayn Rand? Ayn Rand was born February 2nd, 1905, as Elisa Rosenbaum in Russia. Her father was a pharmacist and her mother was a homemaker. Rand grew up with an intense love of reading and was, by all accounts, a rather bright child, though somewhat reclusive socially. Her favorite author as a teenager was Victor Hugo, whose work she thought was beautiful and aspirational. Fast forward, and according to Britannica.com, following the Russian Revolution of 1917, her father's shop was confiscated by communist authorities, an event she deeply resented. For those who aren't aware of Russian history, the Russian Revolution of 1917 was actually two revolutions that happened in Russia in the year 1917. In March, the people overthrew the imperial government, and in October, the Bolsheviks were placed in power. These revolutions were notable because this was when the 300-year Romanov dynasty came to an end, and communism became the state regime. I've linked some articles below if you want to read more about the Russian Revolution. There's a lot to it, and much of it isn't relevant to what I'm discussing today. Something important to note is that Rand was only 12 years old when the Communist Revolution changed her life forever. Her father lost work, and her life went from one of comfort and apparent luxury to rather less than that, though her family wasn't poor by any means, even after the revolution. So Ayn Rand went to college, specifically Leningrad State University, where she studied Aristotle and Plato extensively. And this is important as these philosophers would later become a major part of her own philosophy. She graduated in 1924 and moved to the United States in 1926, where she got work as a screen and play writer and where she married actor Frank O'Connor. Her name was legally Alyssa O'Connor, but her pen name from then on was Ayn Rand. Much of Rand's early work centered on individualism and anti-collectivism. For those who need the definitions, individualism means a doctrine that the interests of the individual are or ought to be ethically paramount, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And collectivism is a political or economic theory advocating collective control, especially over production and distribution. In fact, her novella Anthem was a love letter to individualism and was rather critical of collectivism. In the story, the central concept was that the collectivist future was a dystopian nightmare in which the word I isn't even spoken anymore. In We the Living, her first published novel ever, she wrote a story about the evils of communism and even said that that was the closest she would ever come to penning her autobiography. Rand's first major project was The Fountainhead, which she spent years working on and finally published in 1943. The main point she wanted to get across with this book, aside from her usual individualism versus collectivism messaging, was that egoism is better than altruism, and people should value self above others. In 1957, Rand published Atlas Shrugged, which deepened her messaging from The Fountainhead, and in the appendix of that book, she wrote about her philosophy, Objectivism. She described it as, in essence, the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. I will be reading and doing reviews on all of Rand's work for one mega video of awfulness, so stay tuned for that. I say all of her work, all of her major work, Anthem, We the Living, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged. It might take me a bit, but I really want to do some honest reviews of these books now that I'm no longer an objectivist. Reviewing them from a leftist perspective might be interesting, because I've read them all before, but I definitely didn't do it from this frame of mind. Anyway, there's more to Ayn Rand's life story, such as her affair with Nathaniel Braden. I use the term affair loosely here. It was described as an affair at the time, but in reality, she was probably polyamorous. She and Braden were both married, but each spouse knew of the relationship. There was some drama with all of that, and she ended up breaking up with Nathaniel Braden and dissolving their partnership in an organization they formed together, saying he wasn't adhering to the tenets of objectivism because he had an affair and never told her. Who knows what the real story is there? Anyway, so all that said, what is objectivism? When asked what objectivism is, Ayn Rand said this: My philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. That's not exactly all there is to it, and that sounds innocuous, but I'll dive deeper here in a moment. The Atlas Society has this to say about the definition of objectivism. Objectivism holds that there is no greater moral good than achieving one's happiness, but one cannot achieve happiness by wish or whim. It requires rational respect for the facts of reality, including the facts about our human nature and needs. It requires living by objective principles, including moral integrity and respect for the rights of others. Politically, objectivists advocate for the laissez-faire version of capitalism. Objectivism is benevolent, holding that the universe is open to human achievement and happiness, and that each person has within him the ability to live a rich, fulfilling, independent life. So, let me show you this clip where the Ayn Rand Institute explains objectivism in simple terms.
Objectivism. It's a guide to living here. Developed by this writer. Wondering who needs a philosophy? She answered that. To deal with real life, we need a view of the world and our place in it. Now, some people have strong opinions on objectivism. It's a philosophy that's controversial because it advocates selfishness and says altruism is evil. But we'll get back to that. Rand's philosophy looks something like this. It starts with the idea that reality is objective. The universe is what it is, not what we want it to be. And wishing otherwise won't make it so. Next, it states that our reason is all we have and all we need for understanding the world around us. And if reason is an absolute, you can't accept contradictions. It also says your highest moral purpose should be the pursuit of your own selfish happiness. Now, selfishness can be misinterpreted. It doesn't mean exploit others for your own gain. It means realize your highest potential by pursuing rational ends and live in harmony with others by respecting their right to their own life and happiness. The result of this philosophy is a life of reason, purpose, self-esteem, a philosophy for living on Earth.
If you know that this life is all that you have, wouldn't you make the most of it?
Okay, so that sounds good on the surface, right? I mean, obviously reality is, well, reality. But let's dive a little deeper into her definition of selfishness. It's weird. Let me show you a video in which Rand explains her philosophy herself. It's probably better to hear it from her own mouth anyway. She talks a lot about love and her idea of selfishness in this clip.
Can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it Objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute. That man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it. And that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason. A morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
All right. All right.
Now, may I define what my morality is?
All right.
Because this is merely an introduction. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on Earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people, nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
May I interrupt now?
You may.
Because you put this philosophy to work in your novel Atlas Shrugged.
That's right.
You demonstrate it in human terms in your novel Atlas Shrugged. And let me start by quoting from a review of this novel Atlas Shrugged that appeared in Newsweek. It said that you are out to destroy almost every edifice in the contemporary American way of life, our Judeo-Christian religion, our modified government-regulated capitalism, our rule by the majority will. Other reviews have said that you scorn churches and the concept of God. Are these accurate criticisms?
Yes, I agree with the facts, but not the estimate of this criticism. Namely, if I am challenging the base of all these institutions, I'm challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others, that man must sacrifice himself to others, which is the present-day morality.
What do you mean by sacrifice himself for others? Now we're getting to the point.
One moment. Since I'm challenging the base, I necessarily would challenge the institutions, you name, which are a result of that morality.
All right.
And now what is self-sacrifice?
Yes, what is self-sacrifice? You say that you do not like the altruism by which we live. You like a certain kind of Ayn Randist selfishness.
I would say that I don't like is too weak a word. I consider it evil. And self-sacrifice is the precept that man needs to serve others in order to justify his existence, that his moral duty is to serve others. That is what most people believe today.
Well, yes, we're taught to feel concerned for our fellow man, to feel responsible for his welfare, to feel that we are, as religious people might put it, children under God and responsible one for the other. Now, why do you rebel? What's wrong with this philosophy?
But that is what, in fact, makes man a sacrificial animal. That man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them. That is the role of a sacrificial object. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself, but that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy. And nor should he wish to sacrifice himself for the happiness of others. I hold that man should have self-esteem.
And cannot man have self-esteem if he loves his fellow man? What's wrong with loving your fellow man? Christ, every important moral leader in man's history, has taught us that we should love one another. Why, then, is this kind of love, in your mind, immoral?
It is immoral if it is a love placed above oneself. It is more than immoral, it's impossible. Because when you are asked to love everybody indiscriminately, that is, to love people without any standard, to love them regardless of the fact of whether they have any value or virtue, you are asked to love nobody.
But in a sense, in your book, you talk about love as if it were a business deal of some kind. Isn't the essence of love that it is above self-interest?
Well, let me make it concrete for you. What would it mean to have love above self-interest? It would mean, for instance, that a husband would tell his wife, if he were moral, according to the conventional morality, that I am marrying you just for your own sake. I have no personal interest in it, but I am so unselfish that I am marrying you only for your own good.
Well, should husbands and wives
would
tally up?
Would any woman like that?
Should husbands and wives tally up at the end of the day and say, well, now, wait a minute. I love her if she's done enough for me today, or she loves me if I have properly performed my functions?
No, you misunderstood me. That is not how love should be treated. I agree with you that it should be treated like a business deal, but every business has to have its own terms and its own kind of currency. And in love, the currency is virtue. You love people not for what you do for them or what they do for you. You love them for the values, the virtues which they have achieved in their own character. You don't love causelessly. You don't love everybody indiscriminately. You love only those who deserve it.
And then if a man is weak or a woman is weak, then he is beyond love?
He certainly does not deserve it. He certainly is beyond. He can always correct it. Man has free will. If a man wants love, he should correct his weaknesses or his flaws, and he may deserve it. But he cannot expect the unearned, neither in love nor in money, neither in matter nor spirit.
You have lived in our world, and you recognize the fallibility of human beings. There are very few of us, then, in this world, by your standards, who are worthy of love.
Unfortunately, yes, very few. But it is open to everybody to make themselves worthy of it, and that is all that my morality offers them.
If they will
a way to make themselves worthy of love, although that's not the primary motive.
Okay, so let's break all that down. Objectivism is supposed to be about a man's pursuit of happiness and objective reality. I could get on board the objective reality thing, except that science doesn't really support that there is only one reality, but we won't touch on that right now. Her concept of love is bleak. The idea that love should be handled like a business deal makes me really sad, and also denies science. Side note, if we're denying science, are we accepting objective reality? Food for thought. We know that love is a chemical thing, and I linked a really cool article about it below. Check it out if you like science and cheesy pop song references. So let's talk a little bit about her idea of selfishness. Rand believed that altruism is evil. Individual interest should always come before collective interest, according to her. The problem with that is simple. Humans need each other. The collective interest is the best interest of the individual. Think of it like this. Say there is a row of houses all rather close together. One house on the end catches fire. The occupants of the house on the other end opt not to risk life or limb to help eliminate the fire. It isn't in his best interest to risk his life to put out the fire, right? Or is it? The houses are all close enough together that in no time the entire row of houses is alight, and the occupants who refuse to help are dead. Humans don't really work that way anyway. Usually, when there is a crisis, we all pitch in however we can. It's why GoFundMe and other crowdfunding sites work. We have an instinctive need to protect and uplift everyone, because if we didn't, humanity wouldn't have made it this far. An objectivist would argue that this is why volunteer fire departments work so well, because each individual came together to put their lives at risk for no income whatsoever in order to protect the community from fires. But that goes against Rand's core tenet. Altruism is evil. These volunteers are putting the needs of the many above their own individual needs. But how can a volunteer fire department be evil, right? That's a huge hole in objectivist thinking that really just sort of tears the whole thing apart. That isn't even taking into consideration the fact that Rand's entire philosophy is just nonsense. She never was able to put a coherent thesis together on the whole thing. Instead, she wrote several small books designed to prop up several individual ideas, but put together, it all contradicts itself, and Ayn Rand's objectivism falls apart at the slightest pull of a very thin thread. In fact, most of what everyone seems to think is objectivism doesn't even come from her at all, but instead others who have interpreted her words and created a whole world around her philosophy that she may never even have agreed with. For instance, there are many libertarians who claim the objectivist label, but seem to forget that to be truly objectivist, you must also be atheist. Rand spoke about this a lot. Objective reality denies the existence of a higher power, according to her. So let's talk about how objectivism ties closely into capitalism for a moment, because that's the fourth core idea of this philosophy. The concept of laissez-faire capitalism is pretty simple. Laissez-faire literally means in French, let do you, or leave alone. Investopedia defines it as such. The underlying beliefs that make up the fundamentals of laissez-faire economics include the idea that economic competition constitutes a natural order that rules the world. Because this natural self-regulation is the best type of regulation, laissez-faire economists argue that there is no need for business and industrial affairs to be complicated by government intervention. But we know this doesn't work. Keeping the government out of business, out of corporations, doesn't work. As I talked about in my Let's Talk Capitalism video, regulation is needed. Without government intervention and regulation, the system creates more poverty, and the core idea of objectivism, that people will always choose to do the right thing even without intervention, is proven false. Think about all the pollution caused by corporations. Without the EPA, a government arm designed to regulate corporations, major cities would still be covered in smog and smoke because of the mass amounts of pollution unregulated companies put out. The thing is, despite all of what I've just said, people still follow objectivism, believing it to be the height of morality and logic. I could, and probably will, do a video on the effect objectivism has had on the United States and maybe the world at large, but for now this video is already too long. What's important to know that Objectivism is a philosophy claimed by people who wish not to be controlled by the government. It isn't the same as libertarianism, but there are many overlapping concepts, and each philosophy is highly flawed, in my opinion. Rand, for all her talk of objective reality and reason and truth, seems to have put all that aside. Her opinion of socialism was colored by what happened to her family in 1917 at the hands of the Bolsheviks. She was traumatized by an event beyond her control, and it led her down a path that many others would follow, a path of fear and irrationality. She seems to have misunderstood many concepts, such as selfishness and altruism, and it led her to write many, many books on those ideas. Editing Heather here, I just wanted to make a quick note before I hop off this video. Something that really got to me when I was doing the research for this video, and it didn't make it into the script. The entire concept of objectivism is inherently ableist. Ayn Rand's view is that to be a happy member of society and to reach her weird idea of fulfillment, you have to be a highly productive individual. Not everybody meets the same standard of productivity. Something she talks about a lot in Atlas Shrugged is the main character's brother who runs the business. He's supposedly like a taker and he doesn't contribute much. He's still working for the company, but she considers him to be a taker. So Ayn Rand sort of outs herself in that book as thinking that people who don't work as hard as like the highest productive member of society are takers and don't deserve happiness, which is weird. Especially since productivity is a highly subjective term anyway. Not one person's level of productivity is not going to meet another person's, and that's okay, and we need to normalize that. This idea that we should just be all working like 100-hour weeks and pushing ourselves until we're literally ill. I think that is so unhealthy, and we really need to, as a society, move away from that. So I just wanted to make that note before I finished up this video. Thanks for listening, y'all. So let me know in the comments below. What do you think about Ayn Rand and Objectivism? Have you encountered any Objectivists in the wild? That's all for this video. Next week, I will post my next video in the Tarot series and probably another Stitch and Bitch. I have to get that blanket finished, and I have some more stuff I want to chat about. But that's all for now. Bye, y'all.